Do you ever feel like everything is just conspiring to go against you? Maybe you've thought things are going your way, and then all of a sudden you look at it and it seems like people are starting to try and prevent you from getting that way. Well, if that's the case, welcome to the club. You're not the only one. It's certainly not the first time in history somebody's felt that way. As a matter of fact, King David felt that very way. And the 31st Psalm gives an insight as to how David struggled with some of the difficulties in his own time when things were not going the way that he had hoped they would, or when enemies were starting to oppose him with such strength that it could have discouraged him if he wasn't careful. Listen to what he says in the 31st Psalm. Starting in verse 9, he says, "Be merciful to me, O Lord, for I'm in distress. My eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and my body with grief. My life is consumed by anguish, and my years by groaning. My strength fails because of my affliction, and my bones grow weak. Because of all my enemies, I'm the utter contempt of my neighbors. I'm a dread to my friends. Those who see me on the street flee from me. I'm forgotten by them as though I were dead." And then he says, "I've become like broken pottery, for I hear the slander of many. There is terror on every side. They conspire against me and plot to take my life." Well, I think there are times like that in our life where we think things are going against us to the point where everything and everybody is just opposed to us. But I don't think any of us have ever been to the point like David was. David was the king of Israel, and so David had some very real enemies who are also some very powerful enemies. We typically keep our enemies to a little bit less powerful than David's and a little bit lower profile than David's. But there are times we feel like our friends have abandoned us, that we're just kind of alone as we fight life's battles. And David was just talking about the fact that there really were things that were happening in his life where the opposition was so great that people were actually conspiring to take his life. But then he said this. In verse 14 he said, "But I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hands." This, to me, is one of the greatest promises and one of the greatest passages of hope in the entirety of Scripture. I trust in you. My times are in your hands. Think about that for a moment. There certainly was such pressure on David that he was beginning to feel it. And he knew from just man's perspective, just from his own physical strength and his own power, that he couldn't stand up against these enemies. They were that powerful. And there were conspiracies against him. He said, "They're conspiring against me." There are times that people really are involved in a conspiracy to do things that you wish they wouldn't do. I think about this election, and in many ways this election went the way I was hoping it would go. But since the election, it seems like the enemies have just really risen up, that they're doing everything they can to fight to keep hold of their power. And if it were just against an individual, or if it's just against me even, I suppose we could handle it. But in very real terms, it's a fight between right and wrong. And there are evil people who don't want to give up their evil practices. Have you seen how wicked people have just exploded at the results of this election? Now, I'm not saying that everybody who's been disappointed with the results are wicked, but there are some people who just absolutely love things like sexual immorality, like abortion, just one thing after another that are actually in very clear opposition to God. And these people many times are in positions of power and they don't want to give it up. And so now they're fighting with all their might to keep hold of a little bit of that power and to keep some of the sins that they really like to commit. Well, if you find yourself on that side where there are sins that you don't want to be deprived of, then I would suggest you think very seriously about where you stand before God. But if you're just disappointed in the results of the election because your side didn't win, and it wasn't because you were for wicked things, but you genuinely thought that one side was better than the other, that actually lost, then that's okay. We can disagree over things like that. We can still be friends, I hope. But let me get back to this. Those of us who had the election go the way that we were hoping for it to go are now disappointed that there is so much opposition for the new administration's plans to be able to be implemented. There's a lot of infighting. There's a lot of fighting behind the scenes, and there clearly are conspiracies. What can we do? Well, this is where David's conclusion on his problems and his advice to us comes in particularly useful. He said, "I trust in you, O Lord, my times are in your hands." Think about that. There are some things that are just too big for us, aren't there? While you and I can cast a vote, while you and I can maybe even contact our congressmen or our senators, while we can do certain things, when it comes to the really big things in this world, we have to admit that they're probably beyond the scope of our power. And these are the areas that we need to trust God to take care in. We can certainly have our input, and we can certainly encourage those who are in positions of power to make the best use of that power in as righteous of the way as they can. But when it comes back down to changing the world, you and I really can't. But what we can do is we can trust in God to take care of the things that we cannot take care of. When we think about the fact that we are here as servants, I think that this perspective will help us understand a key attribute of God that David very clearly saw. David realized he was a servant of God, and as such, he understood that his master, God, would provide him with everything that he needed to serve him. And God will do the same for us. If we're serving him to the best of our ability, God's not going to abandon us. He's not going to forsake us. He's not going to just leave us to terrible things such as starvation and poverty and just whatever your imagination will run wild with. God will see to it, as our master, that his servants have what they need to serve him to the utmost of their ability. And so if you and I are absolutely convicted by the idea that we are servants and we're going to serve regardless of the opposition against us because we know that God will provide us with what we need to serve, then that will put our minds at ease. You don't have to worry about starving to death. You don't have to worry about your family doing poorly. I love the passage from Psalms 37 where David said, "I was young and now I'm old, yet I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor their children begging bread." God's not going to forsake us, and he's not going to leave our children in poverty if we're doing what we need to be doing in our service to him. He still is in control. And even though our enemies may seem mighty, God is stronger than they are. And even though there truly are conspiracies to commit evil in this world, God sees what those conspiracies are, and it's within his power to protect us from those things, those plots that people might be planning against us. All we have to do is our best and then trust him to do the rest, because our times really are in his hands. And even if things don't work out in this physical life as we had hoped, even if we don't enjoy all the physical comforts that we desire, we're still going to heaven. And we still have that prospect of being with God, with Christ, for all eternity, with a new type of a service. It's still going to require the same heart. We still need to love him and be determined to serve he and Christ with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And that will carry over into heaven. But once we get to heaven, there's not going to be any death. There's not going to be any sorrow. There's not going to be any sin. I don't know about you, but there are days I can't wait for heaven to start. But until that point, you and I need to just trust in God and understand that our times are in his hands, and his hands are more than capable of taking care of any of the problems that we might encounter, including wicked people who may wish to do us harm. Are your times in God's hands? Do you recognize that? Do you trust him? We all have trouble with that recognition, and we all falter in that trust from time to time. But if we can be more like King David, a man who is after God's own heart, and if we can trust him with all of our heart and realize that our times are in his hands, that he really will take care of us, then I believe that we can get through this life without any undue worry, and we can get through it as best we can. As a matter of fact, not just surviving the slings and arrows of the evil ones in this life, but actually thriving because God is on our side, and he wants us to succeed when we are determined to serve him to the best of our ability. Our times are truly in God's hands. If we'll just trust him, well, he'll take care of the rest. Well, that's the message for today. I hope it's one that uplifts you. There are times when I kind of get down because things seem to be not quite going my way, and so it's really good to go back to passages such as the 31st Psalm and see that even King David from time to time struggled with these things, but he was buoyed, he was uplifted, and he was encouraged to get back and keep on serving to the utmost of his ability because he trusted in God, and we can too. Pray that God will richly bless you as you seek to serve him to the very best of your ability. I hope we'll see you next time. God bless.